Hello everyone, I'm Katie from the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, here with you again today, and I am going to just make sure I have the video up here so anybody asking questions can ask, because I anticipate we might have some today, maybe. Nope, that's my other one. Well, today we're going to talk about the archaeology of the archaeology site that's at the museum. So the site that is adjacent to the museum is the currently known as the Lawson Site. There's something on my screen I had to get rid of there. And it has been sort of known as an archaeological site for well over 100 years. And as I mentioned probably a couple days ago, one of my interests in archaeology is, I'm still trying to find this video, is that history of archaeology, how archaeology developed into what it is today, out of very different origins at the beginning. And it's developed differently throughout the world, but today we're going to talk about specifically the Lawson Site, which is really quite interesting. And here I have it up now. So if anybody asks any questions, I will attempt to answer. I am not the expert on the Lawson Site, but if there's anything that I cannot answer, the Canadian Chair of Archaeology, Dr. Neil Ferris, who's at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, will be responding to some of these questions afterwards if there are some for him. So here we go. So the Lawson Site, we've talked about this quite a bit already, but the Lawson Site was the town of agricultural indigenous peoples about 1500 AD or CE for roughly 20 to 25 years around that time. And the current descendants of those residents are now living in areas of Ontario, Quebec, Michigan, and New York State as well. So sort of spread out from this area. I don't know the years, but it's provincially designated as, or under the Ontario Heritage Act, as well as listed under the federal government as a significant Canadian heritage site. So it's a very prominent archaeological site and significant within the context of archaeology and history here in Ontario, as well as Canada. And there's been excavations on it, as I said, for well over 100 years. And they start off in the 19th century with the discovery at that time, we often talk about the discovery of a site, and Heather actually mentioned a little bit about that whole use of words around discovery of sites. They're often known to locals that the site is there. And in this case, the remains on the futurely known Lawson Site would have been earthworks, which are big mounds of dirt, or sort of long mounds of dirt, which make up part of the palisade construction, which is the wooden wall that goes around the village, as well as various ash pits, fire pits, and other things that would have been a burning fire situation, as well as mounds, which are for the most part probably would have been middens, and middens are garbage pits, so they're sort of refuse piles of things. Lots of artifacts are in them from the stuff that people throw away, and we have big giant middens today, which are called landfills. So in the 1870s through to the early 1890s, the site was sort of well frequented by what's known at that time as curio collectors, which are collectors, and they have interest in the site, but they also sort of used it as a sort of place to go. So they would have picnics there, they would collect things. Obviously this is something that's very specific to that Victorian period of the 1870s to 1890s. But they would have been doing small sort of cursory explorations of things that they were seeing at that time. In 1890, or starting in the 1890s, we begin to have some more archaeologists on site. And it was, the site itself was brought to the attention of an archaeologist named Dr. David Boyle at what is currently the Royal Ontario Museum. I'll talk more about him in a little bit, but the site was brought to his attention by a local geology professor at what is now Western University here in London, and he was also a dentist, and he was a professor of geology. So he was quite broad in his interests, and he was a collector, and he collected things to display in his dentist office. He brought the site, or his name was, I should tell you his name was Dr. Solon Wolverton, and he brought the site to the attention of Dr. David Boyle in 1894. And he published a very, the first description and maps of the site. Yes, he was considered by many to be the first professional archaeologist in Ontario, and he was curator of the Canada Institute as well as the Ontario Provincial Museum, which is now known as the Royal Ontario Museum, as I mentioned. At that point in time, the site was known as the Shah Wood site because it was owned by the land was owned by a man named Mr. Shah Wood, and he was very protective of the site, and a lot of the preservation at that point in time, which was quite unique even for that early point in time, was due to him and his recognition of the site and not plowing things under and that sort of thing. So he worked with Dr. David Boyle, Sir David Boyle, and in Boyle's report, he mentions that the earthworks were exceptionally preserved and were as long as 76 meters or 250 feet, which is a very large chunk of construction, which would have been made entirely out of earth and we would see today as post molds and different things like that. Post molds are the rotten remains of the bottoms of posts that create their own soil and therefore are different colors than the other soils around it. Later next week, I'm going to talk a little bit about context and stratigraphy, which that falls into a little bit more. So I'll talk more about that then. There's another excavator on the site a little bit after David Boyle, named John Sunley, and he was connected with the London and Middlesex Historical Society, and he excavated 6 mounds of ash on the site. Both him and Dr. Wolverton, the early dentist, they are known to have donated some of their collections, or thought to have donated some of their collections, or all of their collections, but it's unknown where those collections have ended up now. So those have been sort of, at least for now, lost. Following Sir David Boyle on the site, we have another archaeologist, or actually another dentist, weirdly, named Dr. Ronald B. Orr. And he was trained by Sir David Boyle at the Ontario Provincial Museum and replaced him as the curator there in 1911 after Boyle's passing. And Dr. Orr visited the then Shah Wood site, current Lawson site, in 1917 and completed a fairly extensive report at that time as well. Following Dr. Orr, we have William J. Winton Berg, and he was an archaeologist at the Geological Survey of Canada in Ottawa and at the Victoria Memorial Museum, which is now known as the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Ottawa. So big museum, it's both of these. And he first visited the site in 1920. And Mr. Shah Wood, at that point in time, did not give William J. Winton Berg permission to excavate on the site. He came back in 1921 when the site had been purchased by Mr. Ray Lawson, and who did grant him permission and was very enthusiastic in the excavations, and also offered logistical and financial support of that site, or of those excavations. Hence the name change to the Lawson Site, which is its current known name. We often just call it the site, though, as well. And so Mr. Where am I here? Yes. So William J. Winton Berg, he excavated at the site in 1921, 1922, and 1923 for a total of about 10 months of excavation over the summer periods in those years. And he excavated and worked very, very quickly, which is a lot quicker than we would today. He was interested in what was underneath the ground and not necessarily what was on the way to underneath the ground. So he excavated 10,000 plus artifacts and documented the palisade and one of the longhouses, and published his findings in 1939 in the National Museum of Canada Bulletin. What's interesting and unique about Winton Berg is that he was actually fairly unique of the archaeologists who were working around this time, in that most archaeologists in Canada at this point were interested in cataloging and classifying artifacts. They weren't too interested in what they were teaching us. So it was more about collecting and understanding patterns within those artifacts, but not in any way about the people. So he was interested in understanding the daily life on the village, and he included information that he determined from his excavations on foods, games that were played, divisions of labor, and all sorts of other things that really look at the daily life of the people on the archaeological site, which is what we want to learn about today in archaeology. We want to learn about who were the people, what did they do, what was their life like, what was their daily life like, and learn about that, with the artifacts being the doorway into that, but not being the be-all and end-all of archaeology. Following Winton Berg, we come to Wilford Jury, and Heather talked about Wilford Jury yesterday and his wife Elsie, and their work with public archaeology, or having that connection with the public in the archaeology that they were doing, both on the Lawson site and on other sites as well that they were working on. And so Wilford Jury excavated with his wife Elsie, as well as with his father Amos, on the Lawson site. He was mostly self-taught, and he actually met Winton Berg in 1921 when he was on the site, and he then later conducted excavations himself between the 1930s and 1950s, quite frequently and sporadic, that are only partially documented, I believe. And he created an early version of a field school at Western. So that's an early version of that field work, hands-on archaeology that students, almost all archaeology students around the world, in wherever they're working, field school is a very important component of that education. And he did that very, very early on. And he convinced Lawson in 1969 as well to donate the property to the university. And so in 1973, not too long after, the plans for what's now known as the Museum of Ontario Archaeology were made. So we're directly connected to that donation of the property, and it's why the museum was located right next to the archaeological site as a means to preserve the site and to utilize the information and the existence of the site to educate and inform the public, which is what Wilford Jury was interested in. So now we're into the museum's sort of component of the archaeology here at the Lawson site. And so with the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, or what's now known as the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, was what's his first name? So excavations and plans for the reconstruction were done by Dr. William Finlayson, who was the museum's first executive director, and he did field schools as well, 1976 to 1978, as well as extensive excavations. He worked between 78 and 83 with Dr. Robert Pierce, who's a former director of the museum, 2002 to 2011, and Dr. David Smith. And they further discovered further information on the town layouts and informed a lot about the reconstructions, again, that we have today. So that information also included 12 plus longhouses that they excavated and recorded. And Dr. Pierce conducted excavations and taught field schools from 81 through to 2011 as well. So this museum has a long history of demonstrations and public archaeology, both through Wilfred Jury and the later archaeologists who are associated with us, or have been associated with us. There's a lot of work still being done on those excavations, and the reports are not complete, but there is a preliminary report that is available in our gift shop online, or when we reopen again, that was compiled by Jacob Anderson, that is available for purchase, and is quite interesting. I read it. And in 2012, it's getting a little bit closer to the current date, the Museum of Ontario Archaeology Board of Directors halted excavations and instead decided to focus on the preservation of the site and specifically the development of a long-term site management plan. And that was for multiple reasons, but also to better involve the local Indigenous community members in the site and what is being done with it and what's going to happen to it in the future. And so excavations on the site have relatively halted, with the exception of some what have been dubbed unfield schools by Dr. Matthew Bowden and Dr. Neil Ferris. And they are essentially looking at non-invasive ways of studying the site with the students. So how can you determine what's here without actually digging into the ground? And there's many ways that can be done. And so that field school covers those methodologies, as well as doing some archaeology of all this past archaeology, which is, again, to me, very fascinating. I don't know if it's fascinating to everybody else, but I like it. And also sort of stabilizing the site and working with that future management plan and how that will be conducted moving forward. So if anyone does have any questions, now or later on watching this when it's posted afterwards, please ask. Either myself or Dr. Neil Ferris will be able to answer those questions, and don't be shy. We love hearing from you, and thank you very much. And tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. again, Heather will be here for you talking about the Victoria Park Archaeological Site here in London. So thank you very much, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.